There's a group of old Jewish men who get together every morning at the coffee shop. One day, as soon as they sit down, one of the men looks at the others and says, "Oy." Second guy takes a sip of his coffee and goes, "Oy vey." Third man speaks up and says, "We agreed we weren't going to talk about Israel." I am going to talk about Israel tonight, and I will tell you on this night of honest confessions that I feel nervous about it. This is probably the most important conversation for us to be having as a Jewish community, but talking about Israel feels scarier and riskier than ever before. I've been a rabbi for more than 20 years now. I've been involved professionally in the Jewish community and in Jewish education for even longer than that. I've spent years living in Israel and studying about Israel. I speak Hebrew. I carry an Israeli passport. I feel confident and well-informed about Israeli history and Israeli politics. And yet, more than any time I can remember, I feel nervous every time I open my mouth to talk about it these days. I feel nervous because too often our conversations about Israel fail to meet Judaism's basic minimal standards about how to talk to each other, and more importantly, how to talk about each other. Those on the right wing of the political spectrum look to their left and call other Jews kapos, collaborators and traitors, and say that they're providing aid and comfort to Israel's enemies. Jews on the left look right and call other Jews fascists and baby killers and accuse them of having the blood of a genocide on their hands. Civic discourse all across our country is suffering. Increasing numbers of young adults feel viscerally uncomfortable when they're exposed to political views with which they disagree. In recent studies, many college students say that they're supportive of forceful tactics like shouting down controversial speakers or physically blocking other students from attending. And a shocking proportion of the young people surveyed reported that they'd be in favor of acts of violence undertaken to stop a speaker from verbally sharing views they found offensive. In 1841, Emerson wrote in his essay on intellect, "God offers to every mind its choice between truth and repose. Take which you please, you can never have both." He's right, there is nothing restful about truth. Truth is agitating and unsettling. When we're faced with new truths that contradict our prior convictions, it can feel uncomfortable or frightening. But we can't just turn our backs and withdraw. It happens far too often. One big disagreement and people cancel their subscriptions, cancel their membership, cancel their parents or their friends. Friends, we've got to get more comfortable being uncomfortable, because the ability to engage in respectful disagreement about issues that matter lies at the heart of our democracy. We are granted the choice between truth and repose, but there's only one viable choice. I want us to speak with each other about things we believe to be true. I want us to show each other our hearts, even when we disagree. This is an unprecedented and unpredictable time for the Jewish world. It's a time of nervousness and fear, a time that calls for our most reliable and most powerful tools. Tonight, I want to talk to you about the blend of those two plentiful and potent commodities, Jewish power and Jewish anxiety. If there's anyone who knows about anxiety, it's us. Anxiety has become culturally inseparable from Jewishness. Show me virtually any identifiably Jewish character in modern literature, film, or television, and I will show you a portrait of anxious neuroticism. Of course, to be fair, we come by it honestly. When you spend as long as we have looking over your shoulder, it tends to have a certain effect on your psyche. Anxiety has been part of the Jewish experience for centuries, working its way deeply into the way we view and understand the world. My teacher, Rabbi Michael Marmer, writes that for Jews, anxiety is both debilitating and stimulating. The 20th century philosopher Emmanuel Levinas explored the roots of Jewish anxiety in a collection of analytical essays about classic texts from the Torah and Talmud. Levinas knew a thing or two about anxiety. When he was 10 years old, his family was chased out of Lithuania by the Russians. Eventually, he fled to France to study philosophy at Strasbourg. And when the Nazis invaded France, he was arrested and sent to a POW camp in Germany. He survived the war, but his father and two brothers, who had remained in Lithuania, were murdered by the SS. One of his essays focuses on the story from the book of Numbers about the spies sent to reconnoiter the Promised Land before the Israelites settled the territory and made their homes there. The biblical text tells us that the scouts returned from their mission shaken and afraid. And Levinas suggests that there may have been multiple factors contributing to their anxiety. First, he says they were probably afraid because they knew that their campaign in the Promised Land carried risks of injury or death. This, sadly, resonates sharply with us today. Anti-Semitic rhetoric, vandalism, and violence are surging everywhere we go, on the internet, on the street, in our offices, and in our schools. All of us know this, and many of us, I'm sorry to say, have encountered it personally. If you're not feeling anxious about anti-Semitism in the world today, you're probably not paying close enough attention. But the other idea that Levinas shares is even more interesting. Perhaps, he says, the spies felt anxious because they knew that to inherit the Promised Land, they would need to wage a war of conquest. It would be a war that they would win, but one that would carry devastating internal consequences, what we would call today moral injury, inner damage stemming from actions that violate one's core moral beliefs. And I think that with this, Levinas put his finger on something insightful and true. Jewish anxiety often increases when it collides with Jewish power. Jewish power sometimes makes us uneasy, and we're not sure why. We may feel uncomfortable or embarrassed when we witness Jewish strength, especially Jewish military strength, being flexed. But Jewish power is not a sin. And today, for the first time in centuries, Jewish power is one of the things helping to keep us safe. Unless you're over the age of 77, you've never known a world without a Jewish state. On nearly every page of Jewish history, someone somewhere was using their resources to try to wipe us out. Now, for the first time in centuries, we have power of our own to resist and thwart their plans. This was the great gift of Zionism and the revolutionary triumph of the establishment of a Jewish state. When Israel joined the family of nations, we were no longer subject to the changing whims of other nations and empires, whose favor could change at a moment's notice, and frequently did. Jewish sovereignty in Israel meant that at last we could be subjects and not objects in the historical grammar of autonomy. There's a famous story about Imre Kertész, a survivor of Auschwitz and Buchenwald, who became the first Hungarian author to win the Nobel Prize for Literature. After the war, later in life, he traveled to Israel and visited an army base. Afterward, a reporter, knowing that Kertész was a committed pacifist, asked him, "So how does it feel to see a Star of David on a tank?" "Well," he answered, "it feels much better than seeing it on my concentration camp uniform." Not everyone appreciates that story. A Jewish star painted on a tank makes some Jews cringe because they believe, maybe subconsciously, that our Jewish sympathy for the powerless emerged from our own history of powerlessness, and therefore, the display and exercise of power itself is somehow anti-Jewish. There's a certain logic to this line of thinking. In the earliest layers of our religious history, Judaism was formed as the spiritual expression of a powerless people imagining what it would be like to have power. Our entire history is dotted with stories about our suffering at the hands of those who held and misused power. The Bible talks about the Egyptians, the Philistines, the Persians, and the Amalekites. In the book of Maccabees, it's the Greeks. In the Mishnah, it's the Romans. In the Talmud, the Babylonians. The theology and liturgy of the medieval rabbis were shaped by countless abuses of popes, inquisitors, and crusaders. On and on and on, we spent centuries on the wrong end of other people's weapons, dispossessed and exiled, mutilated and murdered. And somewhere along the way, we concluded that it was our powerlessness itself that had provided us with a moral conscience. That the purity of Jewish belief and Jewish ethics emerged specifically because of our unique role as history's victims. Over time, the Jewish ethics that developed alongside Jewish powerlessness led us to a self-defeating conclusion. If it was vulnerability that produced our moral clarity, it's only by embracing powerlessness that we can retain the moral high ground. Our history and our literature are filled with inspiring stories about the weak prevailing over the mighty. And so we arrived at the unfortunate and mistaken conclusion that power itself is intrinsically non-Jewish. It is a fact that our legal and spiritual traditions consistently privilege the power of the word over the power of the sword. That's undeniably true. And it's a profoundly beautiful feature of Jewish identity and culture. We've always made heroes of men and women of intellect and insight, whose talents lay in their ability to write, study, analyze, and teach. But physical power is no less foreign or antithetical to Judaism than intellectual power. We are survivors. All of us are survivors. We would never have endured our history of dispossession and exile if we weren't. The long life of the Jewish people comes from our spiritual imagination and our deep reserves of inner strength, which consistently surprised the rest of the world. During the long years, we worked and waited and fought to provide for our own safety. And that, simply put, is the definition of Zionism. By our own power, we will decide our own future. Our fate will not be determined by the nations of Europe or America, not by the Vatican or by the United Nations, and it certainly won't be decided by those who want to see us destroyed. Zionism means that the Jewish people has the unique ability to preserve the Jewish future. This is why we should not feel self-conscious when we have conversations about Israel, history's best example of Jewish self-determination. Some people misread Zionism as an expression of authoritarianism, but in fact the opposite is true. Zionism is the most liberatory and salvific force in Jewish history. We need not feel embarrassed about celebrating its successes, including its military successes over the past 2 years. Israel was barely emerging from the howling grief of October 7th when it disassembled Hamas's chain of command, shattered the arsenals of Hezbollah, undermined the Syrian dictatorship, and humiliated an Iranian regime which had long dreamed of immolating Israel in a regional ring of fire. These victories of intelligence, strategy, and strength made an entire region of the world safer, and they should fill us with Jewish pride. And now, if what we're hearing is true, it seems that a fragile thread of hope for the end of this war may just be emerging at last. I hope desperately that the Palestinians and their leadership will seize hold of it. And I hope just as fervently, for our part, that we will remain anchored firmly in truth and not repose. We must acknowledge the grievous suffering in Gaza, even as we celebrate Israel's successes. This is evidence not of weakness, but of strength. It is proper and it is strong for us to ache about the hunger and destruction there and to mourn the senseless tragedy of thousands of dead children, even given the exigent realities of war. The responsibility for those deaths lies at the feet of Gaza's terrorist overlords, but we are morally entangled with those tiny corpses. We may not simply shrug them off if we want to preserve the ethical core of our Jewish heritage and avoid the moral injury which paralyzed our predecessors as they stood trembling on the border of the Promised Land. The exercise of Jewish power requires caution and discernment. Like all varieties of power, ours is not immune from corruption. Like all varieties of power, Jewish power may reinforce the basest impulses of those who hold it. It requires solid ethical and legislative bumpers to ensure that it doesn't overrun our core moral values. The establishment of a Jewish state meant that for the first time, we gained control over all the elements of statehood and all the responsibilities of maintaining civil society in our own land. This is the great gift of Zionism, and it is also the weightiest challenge for a democratic Jewish state. It will be an expression of strength and moral vigor for Israel to begin prosecuting the nationalist vigilante groups who victimize Palestinians with impunity. It will be an act of strength and confidence to reverse the breakdown of order in Israel's police force and the ethical collapse of its finance ministry. It will be a demonstration of strength and liberty to stop capitulating to extremist religious sects and end the giveaways of lavish tax breaks and military exemptions to those who oppose the principles of modern democracy. We do not need to feel ambivalent about Jewish power. Being strong is important, and it is morally good, but it is vital that we remain insistently committed to the ethical use of power. Who is strong, asks Pirkei Avot, the ethics of our fathers? The one powerful enough to subdue one's own impulses, it answers. I believe that the war in Gaza was justified, and I believe that it is just. But I want it to be over. I want all of our precious hostages to come home, and I want Israel to win. I want Israel to be as secure as it can be and as moral as it can be. I want us to love it. I want us to love our Jewish homeland because of its virtue, as well as because of its beauty and inspiring history. And I want you to come to Israel with me next year on a congregational trip in December, during which we'll focus on Israel's role in the new Middle East. An itinerary which will include some very special highlights I can assure you that you've never seen, experienced, or tasted before. More details to come. In a landmark essay that he wrote in 1982, Rabbi David Hartman asks a pointed question. If one geographical location were considered the orienting category of the Jewish state, what would it be? Would it be Athens, the seat of ancient democracy and culture and reason? Would it be Jerusalem, the beating heart of Jewish peoplehood and the nerve center of our religious, civic, and judicial history? Or, he asks provocatively, would it be Auschwitz? Judaism's most forceful reminder about the consequences of vulnerability and the inconsistent and fragile goodwill of the nations of the world. He says no. Instead, the character of the Jewish state was forged at Mount Sinai, because it was there that we were instilled once and for all with a uniquely Jewish blend of power and obligation. Sinai calls us to living constantly with the challenges of building a moral and just society, he writes. It is the antithesis of the moral narcissism that can result from viewing oneself as a victim. He urges us to reject any conception of the world that is rooted only in calculations of victimhood and suffering. At Sinai, God taught us to spurn idolatry, and we are bidden just as sternly to shun the uncritical worship of the idols of power and dominion. I wanted to talk to you tonight about both power and anxiety, because it is from the peculiar intertwining of those two forces that the wondrous alchemy of this great day emerges. The Day of Atonement is a day of Jewish anxiety, when we're gripped with nervousness about what we've done in the past year and what awaits us in the year ahead. But Yom Kippur is also a day of Jewish power, a day when we are at our very strongest. On Yom Kippur, we find in ourselves the capacity to withstand challenge, the ability to overcome our appetites, the will to apologize, and to forgive. These are acts of great power. On this day, we address God in an ancient idiom of imperial paternal strength, Avinu Malkeinu, our Father, our King, and we do not flinch from the idea that there is power in the universe. But we don't worship it. We do not worship power. We are comforted by the knowledge that God's strength is accompanied and balanced by a boundless capacity for mercy. Friends, these are hard and anxious times. These are times that may make us feel afraid, even when we're confident in what we believe. But this great day offers an antidote to our anxiety and an invigoration of our own potency, one we can access through real relationship with God and with each other by sharing our hearts and treating each other with tenderness as we hew out the shining goodness sheltered inside us. I know that you'll find what you're looking for. You are children of the Most High. Remember how powerful you are. Do not be afraid of your own strength. You are capable of extraordinary things. On these Yamim Noraim, these days of might and power, of strength and capability, may God strengthen us to change the things that must be changed, to seize hold of our destiny, and to take our future into our hands. We know that we cannot have truth and repose at the same time. So on this holiest of days, my friends, let us gain strength from each other as we continue the tireless search for what is true and good. Shana Tova, an easy fast to all.